Welcome to Inside Politics with Kevin Klein, beyond the headlines, beyond the spin. Straight facts, sharp analysis, and common sense conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Let's get started.
Hi, I'm Kevin Klein. Welcome to another edition of Inside Politics. I am joined by three of my colleagues. Jeff Currier, a Winnipeg Sun columnist and broadcaster. We have Royce Koop, a Winnipeg Sun columnist and professor of political sciences at the University of Manitoba. And we're joined by new Sun columnist Lawrence Pinsky, a member, I guess, an attorney, but a member of the King's Counsel and a former arbitrator, I believe, for the human rights.
Human rights adjudicator, actually appointed both by NDP and Conservatives, interestingly.
Oh, well, we're going to have fun with that, for sure. We got a lot to talk about this week on Inside Politics. We've got some tariff news we're going to talk about. We've got the Air Canada strike we're going to share a little bit of information on. I want to talk about an incident that happened in Winnipeg during a cultural celebration that both Jeff Currier and Lawrence Pinsky wrote about. We're going to talk about that. And play a little clip of what Premier Smith said about a criminal act and some charges that were laid in Ontario. But first, I want to talk about some facts that came out that and I want to make sure I get them right here. Billions of dollars from Canadian investors have left the country. It looks like $8.3 billion left this country in June and $14 billion in May. What does that say about Carney'S Canada?
Let me take the first shot at it, if that's okay. You have to bear in mind what Lawrence Peter said. Lawrence Peter developed the Peter Principle that essentially says that an employee in a hierarchical entity tends to rise to their own level of incompetence and then stay there. And that's what we see unfortunately, with Mr. Carney. He's risen to a high level of incompetence and he's staying there because the truth is, if you're at the highest marginal rate of taxes, you're paying well over 50% of your income in taxes. And it's not as though we're getting services back for that. We're not. We have a bankrupt medical system. We have roads that don't work, hospitals that don't work, transportation systems that don't work, education system that doesn't work, university that doesn't work. I want to be the optimist. I want to be happy about Canada. But the truth is, people who have the ability to leave are leaving. And not only are they leaving with their capital isn't coming into Canada, which we need to grow the economy. There is a huge crisis and brain drain that is not being reported on, never mind the collapse of the culture, of the Canadian culture. And that will touch on your Folklorama question, which will come up afterwards.
Right.
But it's really a disaster going on in Canada on many fronts. And we all need to wake up to it before it's too late.
Jeff, your thoughts on the money that's leaving the country?
Well, I think to Lawrence's point, people are going to go not just where they can make the most money, but where they can pocket the most money. And if you're losing more than 50% of your income in taxes, remember, in the old communist Soviet Union, people got to keep 50% of their income. In the communist Soviet Union, people got to keep 50% of their income. So what does that tell us about where we're going here in this country? That it's beyond compassion for the poor, but it is now resentment of the rich. It is the contempt we have in Canada for wealthy people, and it's the old Canadian lobster story. You got 30 seconds for me to tell a quick story on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
That the visitor is walking down the docks in St. John's, and he's getting a tour, and he said there's a barrel with a lid on it, and he says, "What's in the barrel?" "Well, them's American lobsters. We caught them off the coast of Maine yesterday morning." "Why is there a lid?" "Well, the American lobsters keep trying to climb out of the barrel." Okay, they continue along the tour, and there's another barrel, and the visitor looks in, it's a bunch of lobsters. "What are these?" "Well, them's Canadian lobsters. Cut them off the coast of St. John's this morning." "How come there's no lid?" "Well, you don't have to worry about them Canadian lobsters. Every time one of them tries to climb out, the others grab them and pull them back down."
Kind of describes it.
Right. That's where we are in Canada. It is a resentment of the rich. And lest we forget, it is the rich who pay the most amount of tax in this country and provide the services that we need. And we're driving them out of Canada.
One would have thought that, given Mark Carney's experience that he touted all the time, and the fact that he's involved in a lot of investment properties and such, that these investors would have banked on Carney, Royce. But it looks like they're not banking on Carney at all.
Yeah, I just want to say you might have to include closed captioning for when Jeff was doing his Newfoundland accent there for our viewers. It is a very concerning thing, and you really can't blame investors for taking their money elsewhere. I've said before, for the first time in my life, I'm very concerned about the future of my country, about the future of a country that I'm going to be giving my daughter. And that has to do with governance. It's like 95% governance, decisions that are being made by people that are in positions of authority. One thing we didn't get, the field is just so flooded right now. One thing we really didn't talk that much about, or we didn't hear that much about in the media, are these Chinese tariffs of canola and other tariffs that are coming. The truth is we knew those were coming. It was like a slow moving train heading towards Canada. Nothing was done to stop it. Those are going to be crippling tariffs. They're going to have massive implications for this country. And the idea is they're there because, in at least the official explanation, is because Canada has these massive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Is it really worth it to cripple Canadian agriculture in order to kind of prop up the fledgling electric vehicle industry in this country? It's just bad decisions that are being made at the government level. That's the concern, I think. This country, enormous potential wealth, enormous potential development. It's the decisions of policymakers that are hurting us.
But look at the response from Manitoba Premier Wam Kanu. Immediately, oh, well, government's going to have to hand out money to the farmers. So where do we get the money that we're going to hand out to the farmers? The response wasn't, we need to negotiate better with China. We need to remove those tariffs. It wasn't an intelligent response. It was a populist response, if you ask me. He's just looking for people to love him and saying, well, we're just going to give people money. So that is a problem, certainly. And I think that is why investment dollars are leaving. And it did show that a lot of that investment went from the Canadian stock market or Canadian companies into the U.S. And that's a scary thought. Another thing that, in Carney's Canada that I think I really want to talk about today is that Lawrence Pinsky and Jeff Currier both wrote an article about an incident that happened at the Israel Pavilion during Folklorama in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now, in Winnipeg, Folklorama is a huge celebration, 2 weeks long, of all the various cultures around the world. And people go to different pavilions. They get to experience food and they get to experience the culture. They learn a little bit about everybody. But something nasty happened at the Israel Pavilion. And Lawrence, we'll start with you.
It really was unbelievable. Royce talked about his concern for the future of Canada for his daughter. I'm concerned for my kids and grandkids exactly the same way. Part of it is what we saw at the pavilion over the week that it was on. Unbelievably, we had people standing opposite the pavilion playing at tremendous volumes, sounds of gunshots, sounds of bombing, screaming. On another day, we saw people unbelievably using sexualized slurs, yelling them at little girls and at women. I won't repeat them here. Saying to others, Hamas is coming for you. Hamas, as everyone knows, is that terrorist organization that led us all down this path. False signs, screams, telling Canadians, go back where you came from because they're Jewish. I was sworn at as a effing Jew. On and on and on. It was unbelievable, yelling at politicians and at guests. Now, there were some people there who had signs that I would say are wrong and I disagree with, but were quiet. So they're misguided, with the greatest of respect to them. But they because they see really the horror that's going on in Gaza and they want to respond, and they're being misdirected by a biased mainstream media. But there's others who were completely, unbelievably out of control. One of these people, actually, this is quite remarkable. He said that his brother was killed fighting in Lebanon for Hezbollah. And somehow we allow these people into the country. And we don't, it seems like there's no security checks, and they seem to import their hate, whether it's for the LGBTQ community or for Jewish people, eventually for other people too. But that's what they do. And at some point, Canada and Canadians, not just Canadians, have to ask themselves, is this the Canada that we want for our kids and grandkids? Isn't this the time to rise up and say, no, this isn't it, and to stand together? Because at some point, history will judge us in Canada as they judged people in Europe back in the 30s and 40s, or as we do in retrospect. That's what's critical. And I'm waiting to see non-Jewish people, Christian people, Hindus, Sikhs, reasonable Muslim people come forward and say, this is not my Canada. We didn't come to Canada to bring that war here.
Now, I'm going to stop you right there. That is very bang on, I would say, to what Jeff talks about in this weekend's Winnipeg Sun. Jeff, is that not correct?
Yeah, and I think to expand on or to carry on what Lawrence was talking about, for me, this is separate and apart from how you feel about what is happening in Gaza right now. Whether or not you feel Israel's actions are justified or not, how you feel about October 7th, this is about what's happening on Canadian soil amongst people who have no participation in the conflict that is going on over there right now. That remember that our motto as Canadians is peace, order, and good government. So peace and order are now under threat because of this. And I've said this before, and I mentioned it again in this week's column, that we still have a country, but I'm not entirely certain that we still have a nation. Because those two things are they're not exactly the same. We have a country because we have structure and government and so on. But having a nation is something altogether different. So what is it now that binds us together as Canadians, as a nation? And my concern is that we've become so increasingly tribal that we no longer have a cultural mosaic. We now have a fractured society. And that's my concern.
Yeah, I big agreement with Jeff here. I mean, I think we Canadians can reasonably disagree on, what's happening in Gaza, whether or not the Canadian government has taken the right position. That's entirely separate from some of the things that we've seen that Lawrence was describing. It frankly makes my blood boil, because no other group in Canada has to endure this kind of these kinds of antics directed at their events, their venues, their gatherings. It was about a year ago in Toronto. There was one of these protests at nighttime outside of a Jewish old folks home in Toronto. I don't know if that's the right term anymore, old folks home. It's the term that I use. But
that's what we're going to call the show. We're going to call this show the Old Folks Show.
The seniors' home. But I read the headline, I read the story. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I actually went onto Google Maps, and is this actually a seniors' home? So you had people with making noise, playing music, shouting slogans that were hostile. And in the old folks' home, there were people with dementia who had no clue what was going on, the family trying to go in and out. There's no reason why we should tolerate this. We can have an appreciation of freedom of expression. We want that. But no reasonable people should tolerate this kind of behavior, yelling slurs at little kids. And the truth of the matter is there are laws, there are bylaws, there are sound bylaws, there are disturbance laws. You can't just create a disturbance wherever you want to that are not being enforced. And I think an awful lot of Canadians their patience has been worn very thin on this issue, and these laws should start being enforced.
Well, I that's my big thing is I'm being the former chair of the Winnipeg Police Service and being involved with a different police service many years ago. I am shocked that we're not arresting these people and throwing them in jail overnight. They need to be arrested if they're spewing hate. We have crimes of hate being done in the country, and the police are not taking any action whatsoever. Now, I don't think the police are making that decision. I think that decision's being made from higher up, and that's the lack of leadership, if you will, especially here in Winnipeg, with Mayor Scott Gillingham, quiet on this issue, doesn't want to talk about the issue. Wab Kinew, quiet on the issue, doesn't want to talk about the issue. And then, of course, you had compare that to when we had a group of people that protested in front of an abortion clinic. And I know it's a touchy topic, but immediately the NDP party went and made it wrong. And city council made it a law, and they enforced that law. But they're afraid, for whatever reason, to go after these hate mongers. And that's what they are. They're hate mongers in our very own country, in our very own city. And Lawrence, you're a lawyer. I mean, these should be criminal charges.
Well, I want to touch on a few things that both you, Kevin, and Royce said. And it's really, really fascinating to me. I've done a fair bit of work on this. Not only, Royce, was it the what we're calling the seniors' residence or the old folks in Toronto, there were schools that were attacked. There was the Mount Sinai Hospital was attacked because it has a Jewish name. It was unbelievable. In Winnipeg, a Jewish family had their window shot. There have been incident after incident. Now, hate crimes are difficult to prosecute. The law needs to be amended. But I want to tell you a few other things. This was almost a textbook case of harassment, of unlawful assembly, of mischief. When you read those sections of the criminal code, that's what this describes. Never mind the noise bylaw and the livability bylaw, but actual criminal code offenses. So I can tell you that I personally spoke with a former very high up person in the police department who asked me this after some back and forth about why they weren't enforcing the law. And they start by saying that really our job is to separate groups as though it's equal, the people waving Canadian flags singing "O Canada" versus the people shouting sexualized slurs at little kids. But anyway, he said to me, Lawrence, if you can get the Crown to charge, we'll do it. Think for a moment what that means. That means that the Minister of Justice and the provincial government are saying, don't charge or we won't charge. So even though they may have referred a matter to the Crown, the higher ups are saying no, they don't. If they can't understand the difference between freedom of expression and mischief and unlawful assembly and harassment, they have no business being in the office that they're in. And just to bring it back to the abortion question, the issue of free expression on the issue of bubble legislation went all the way up through the courts in BC on the very issue of the abortion bubble zones. And the court was pretty clear that it isn't, or it may be an infringement on freedom of expression, but it's justified in a free and democratic society to say that and to allow those sorts of limits to be in place. And they held it wasn't unconstitutional. Why don't we have bubble legislation in Winnipeg and in Manitoba? And it's inconceivable to me. And I can tell you that certain councillors are trying to put it forward. I don't know where the mayor is. The mayor could tell the police, as could the Minister of Justice, not specifically charge X, but enforce the law. They're choosing not to do it, and it's despicable, frankly, that they're doing it. It's the ruination of Canada, frankly, if you can't tell the difference between those things. You shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think it's political leadership that's to blame here, to be quite frank. I had attended a dinner once, and I got to sit with Stephen Harper not that long ago, and Stephen was telling people at the table the biggest problem in politics today is that every politician seems to be afraid to take a stand. They won't take a stand on anything, and that's an issue, right, Royce?
Yeah, absolutely. That's if this is going to come to a debate in Winnipeg, I'd like to see that about bubble laws around these sorts of facilities and these sorts of events, because what Lawrence is describing is escalation. If you don't deal with small crimes, if you don't deal with small problems, eventually they turn into big problems, and that's exactly what we've seen over the last 1 or 2 years. Fairly innocuous protests about human rights turned into protests that are completely blocking off streets in Toronto, and suddenly they're in front of Jewish schools and old folks' home. All of a sudden, you're playing sounds of gunfire Well, what's next? That's the question that kind of concerns me. What's the next step in escalation? There's a video out of Nanaimo in BC where one of these protesters was shouting into a bullhorn, and an RCMP officer came up to her and said, "You're creating a disturbance. If you don't stop, I'm going to arrest you." And the protesters were kind of mystified by this and reasonably like, what? Are you, I can't just scream into a bullhorn at all hours of the day. Well, if you don't enforce laws, if you don't enforce bylaws, you can't blame people when they continue to break them and continue to escalate. And so that's my concern, I think, is we need to see some of these things enforced.
Yeah, I think we all know the answer rhetorically. If this same sort of thing had happened outside a mosque with people going in for Friday prayers, or if the same sort of thing had happened outside the Rainbow Resource Center, I think we know what the reaction would be from both law enforcement, the local media, local politicians. I think we all know the answer. So why is the standard different at the Jewish Pavilion at Folklorama?
That's a great question because I have been pondering that for a while. And I know from being in politics and knowing a lot of these politicians, very nice people and all that, but they depend greatly upon new Canadians. They've, to do door knocking for them, to deliver flyers and all this kind of stuff. And that seems to be where they want to focus, is they all want to be, focusing on their needs and on their desires. And no politician is talking about it. I think it's worse for a politician not to take a stand and be quiet during this than it would be to come out and take a side and stand up for it. I think that's wrong. I think it's unfair to people that politicians should stand up because you're right, Jeff. If it had happened at the Rainbow Center or at a mosque, wow, we know what would have happened then. But I want to talk about that because it's kind of what's happening in Canada. It's that lawlessness. I'm going to play a clip here of Premier Smith from Alberta. She answered a question. A reporter asked her. The Kawartha police, and I think it was somewhere in Lindsay, charged a man who attacked somebody who broke into his home. And here's what Daniel Smith had to say.
I wanted to get your reaction to an incident, I believe, in Lindsay, Ontario, where a man is now facing criminal charges for defending himself from a home intruder. What are your thoughts on that situation?
Well, if you don't want to get shot or beaten up, don't break into people's houses. Pretty straightforward. We had a similar incident in Alberta where somebody defended themselves, and they determined that there was not a reasonable likelihood of conviction, because we do expect that people are going to use a reasonable use of force to defend themselves and their families, and I support
Daniel
that.
Smith, I don't think she was trying to get the crowd to cheer and laugh, but she certainly said something important, which I think is that we should have the right to defend ourselves. And I'm going to, talk to Lawrence about this for a second. Lawrence, with being a lawyer, do we have the right to defend ourselves in Canada if somebody breaks into our home?
You do. You have the right to defend yourself, but there's big, what should I say, perhaps a subjective when you're talking about self-defense issues. So, major case that went to the Supreme Court was Hodgson in 2024, and it does talk about the right of self-defense. In that case, an accused was at a house party. He was asked to help remove a riotous, difficult individual that sometimes happens at house parties. An altercation ensued. This fellow applied a chokehold on the unruly fellow in the middle of the fight, and the guy lost consciousness and died. Mr. Hodgson was charged, and he was actually acquitted, interestingly, by the trial court, and then he was sent back for a trial again by the Court of Appeal. The Supreme Court actually upheld his acquittal. And they talk about the issue of self-defense. You can, but there's a reasonability question, reasonability standard, both involving one's mental state. They look at the catalyst, the person's motivation, and their response. So what was it that the person who acts in self-defense, what caused them to have to do that? What was the catalyst that made them react in the way they did? What was their motive in actually doing whatever it was that they did? And finally, was the response proportionate based on a reasonable person? And there's part of the problem, because a reasonable person on the street in the middle of the fight, I would argue, might well be a complete stranger to a justice have the Court of Appeal of the Supreme Court. Thankfully, they don't have to deal with that. They don't deal with that. They live with it, and they try their best. This is no slight on judges, but they really live a certain type of lifestyle that doesn't see that type of break-in. In fairness, in Manitoba, we had a really good judge of our Court of Appeal, Hugh Band, who he always disagreed with me whenever I appeared before him. He never ruled in my favor, but he then became one of my colleagues here at my firm. Great guy, now deceased. He had a break-in actually at his house. He had a home invasion. So he actually spends it, but most of them don't, and they don't know what it's like. They have an idealized, to some degree, concept of what that reasonable person would do in the heat of battle of someone coming into your house, invading it, threatening yourself, your spouse, your children, and that's a really interesting standard. So the short answer to your question, Kevin, is yes, there's a right of self-defense, but it's very
Yeah, well, not quite that short, but yeah, I totally understand that. But I mean, but with me, like my mother was murdered. It was domestic violence. But if someone broke into my home, I'm going to do everything I can to protect my family. Everything I can. Would you not do the same, Jeff?
Yeah, of course. And as Lawrence kind of alluded to it, the law as it's written is theoretical. It's a theoretical situation where you're permitted to use proportional force. Well, if somebody breaks into your house, you don't know how well armed they are, if they are armed. All you know is that someone has broken into your home and is a potential threat to your property, to your well-being, and to the safety of your family. And at that point, I think most reasonable people would say you use whatever means are at your disposal to defend your property, your safety, and your family. And proportional, I think, is a word that needs to be removed from the law because it's strictly theoretical. It's not a real world situation. Somebody breaks into my house, one of us is going down.
Yeah, some of the discussion about this has been a little ridiculous in the media. No one is saying that someone breaks into your house, it gives you the right to subdue them and lock them in your basement. It turns into like a Pulp Fiction scenario or something like that. People have the right to protect themselves and their families. And sometimes politicians, precisely like Danielle Smith, kind of channeling her inner Ralph Klein. It's good. She can kind of cut through a lot of that with a statement that's very sensible to me. The big thing about this is Canadians' confidence in the justice system and in the government to keep them safe. I think a lot of Canadians feel that crime is out of control, violent crime is a real concern, and those that are in elected positions aren't doing enough to protect them from criminals. Instead, what they're doing is police are chasing after people who go for walks in forests in Nova Scotia, and they're prosecuting people who break into their homes. And it creates this general sense that the justice system is there for the criminals, not for law-abiding Canadians. And that's what concerns me is the kind of, it dents people's confidence in government and in the justice system and in the police.
Well, you know what? I think it's going to be the quote of the decade, where she said, if you don't want to get beaten up or whatever, don't break into somebody's house. Thank you very much. That should be the rule. Everyone should follow that. And that's pretty much putting it the best way possible. If you don't want to get beat up, don't break into my home and you won't have a problem. I think too, though, is that we talked about the judges and Lawrence, of course, tiptoed around the judges. Being a lawyer, he has to do that. But I mean, we're look at what we pay judges.
Well, let me talk about that.
But I don't really want to get into it. I mean, we pay them over $400,000. I think it's ridiculous. That's way too much money. And they're the ones that are letting crime happen. And you talked about how they don't really know. They try to do their best and so on. But we have less crimes for immigrants. Royce talked about that on our last show. That was ridiculous. We just have crime happening. And who do you not hear from about all the crime happening in Canada? Not a word? Prime Minister. Mark Carney has not once spoken about crime in Canada. It might be because maybe he doesn't live here. Maybe he's just visiting, but he has not spoken about crime.
So in my view, it does rest with the politicians and the lack of leadership. It's the same problems we've identified on different files now in this very conversation. And it's constant. It's not a judge problem in many cases. And often I find myself, I think I wrote a column actually about a recent Supreme Court of Canada case that made absolutely no sense to me on a young offender, which I won't explore now. But the reality is that there's a lack of leadership, a lack of moral compass among the political class. Although, would I trust this, a liberal party, to amend the legislation to make it clearer? No, they wouldn't get it right. That's the reality. They'd make it worse, probably. It's bad as it is. On the issue of compensation for judges, just for a second, there's a different reality for what they make if you live in Toronto or Vancouver versus Winnipeg. So, Kevin, I think you're talking about in Winnipeg, it's a different reality, that number, than if you're in Toronto or Vancouver. There really is a different step. So I'll leave it there. Won't tiptoe, but I will leave it there on that.
I think, Jeff, you had touched on that one of our previous shows, saying that it's not the judges who make the law. This is about the Supreme Court decision on immigrants. And that was very thoughtful, I think, on your part. You're absolutely right. It's not the judges that make the law. They uphold the law. And I believe you said politicians, which is true.
Right. Yeah, and it's up to the judges in the Supreme Court to interpret the law, but not to recreate it or amend the law. And as I've said before, I think, and when it comes to our Supreme Court, there's so much knowledge, but not always enough wisdom to go along with it.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I don't have to be as nice as Lawrence. I'm just a professor. I can criticize judges. In the past, we had a tradition of court curbing, a term that we imported from the United States, where people criticize judges for the decisions that they rendered for engaging in policy making rather than deferring to people that are actually elected to do that. There's a lot of that in the 90s, but we haven't seen that much of it recently. We don't really criticize judges. I'd like to see a lot more criticism of judges when they engage in policy making. Really, the only way to address this is through government, electing people that are going to address that. Lawrence mentioned the young offenders decisions that we've gotten recently that I've written about. Those are just one example of a place where the government needs to intervene to clarify the law for the courts.
Well, I think Daniel Smith, as a premier, clarified it very simply.
Well, if you don't want to get shot or beaten up, don't break into people's houses. Pretty straightforward.
That you couldn't get more simple and direct than that. And who really can argue with that? It's such a common sense, intelligent point of view. Royce, I don't think you mean criticize judges. I think you mean that in the right case where they write a decision that perhaps you don't think is sound, and reasonable people can disagree, for sure, you should criticize that decision. It's not the judge, it's the reasoning or the decision that you're saying I disagree with. Like that recent Supreme Court of Canada decision dealing with the 17-and-a-half-year-old who stabbed a young person to death, bragged about it, and will be out in a year or less after the Supreme Court rendered its decision, overturning the trial judge, overturning the Court of Appeal on a very subjective basis, in my, we like to say, respectful view, that it's very hard to understand. The issue of activism in the court is, in fact, we don't see it at trial or usually Court of Appeal in Manitoba, but it is a problem. We see it still in the States a lot. And it's a problem that can undermine how people feel, the confidence that they repose in the judiciary that's so important.
Well, I think we know now that Canadians, still one of the biggest issues with Canadians is crime. They don't feel safe in this country anymore. Carney's not talking about it. I mean, Carney's Canada is very different than what he said it was going to be. And breaking news while we're taping the show, Carney has announced that he will be eliminating the retaliatory tariffs on some goods with the United States that were part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the, I can't remember what they call the new one now, the UMSU, whatever it is. Interesting, because he was only hurting Canadians with this, and he's making it sound like a major win. Like, Jeff, I mean, how can you stand up there and say, look, I had a conversation with Donald Trump, and it went so well that I'm going to take off tariffs on a free trade agreement that the Americans didn't have tariffs on our products. We were the only ones that had them, and it made life more expensive for everyday Canadians.
Well, yeah, but bear in mind, Kevin, that you're the one who supports Donald Trump's in the tariffs because of the amount of money that brings into the federal coffers, and that's where the money goes, into federal coffers. But it does, and my argument is that yeah, it might do that, but it hurts consumers. Tariffs hurt consumers at every level, and so removing tariffs might help. I know Mark Carney was, and we've talked about this repeatedly, that Carney was the guy who said that he was going to be able to get a deal done with Donald Trump. He was going to be able to handle Trump. He miscalculated on that, because Donald Trump, the only person apparently who can handle Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin. Otherwise, Donald Trump is uncontrollable. He is unstable and is unpredictable and unprincipled. And so I only fault Carney insofar as he overestimated his ability to deal with Donald Trump, not the fact that he hasn't been more successful.
So, a quote from our Prime Minister today: let's be absolutely clear, Canada currently has the best trade deal with the United States. And while it's different from what we had before, it is still better than that of any other country. Royce, thoughts?
Well, the retaliatory tariffs are always questionable policy. It hurt Canadians. Yeah, other countries weren't doing it. Didn't seem to be helping us get a better deal with Trump. And the problem, of course, is that Carney boxed himself in on this question. He won an election campaign on the basis of putting his elbows up and cracking down and fighting and doing battle with the Americans. And so that made it difficult for him. I mean, this is a defeat for Carney. This is someone who won an election just a few months ago on the basis of being tough, and now he's getting rid of kind of the centerpiece of that policy. So however he spins it, this is a loss. I think it's good policy. I'm happy about that. But I'm bothered to see the Liberal Party once again like turning its back on what it said just a few months ago in an election campaign. It creates a lot of cynicism, I think.
Well, I'd like to say, don't make this a win for you. You know what I mean? I mean, just come out and tell the truth. Be transparent about it. This was hurting us in our negotiations with the United States. I made a mistake, so we're going to remove the tariffs that we have put on items that fell under the CUSMA, as it's referred to. We shouldn't have had tariffs on those products. Trump didn't have tariffs on those products. So just come out and say, you know that you made a mistake and you've changed that.
Let's actually go back for a second, because that agreement is going to be renegotiated in a year or less. The move to tariff those items was so self-destructive. It's unbelievable, because it now opens the door for the Americans to get even worse. For Mr. Carney to claim credit for that agreement that he had nothing to do with is ridiculous. And it shows just a complete, if Canadians buy that, that's really a comment on how Canadians aren't paying attention to what's actually going on. Ronald Reagan once said, in a similar context of free trade, he said, if you're in a boat and the person opposite you in the boat starts taking out a gun and shooting holes in the bottom of the boat, is your best move to take out your gun and also shoot at the bottom of the boat, or is to try to talk to them and stop it? I'd argue that in terms of Mr. Trump, Jeff, I don't agree with you. He talks like he has personality disorders, that he probably has. But if you look at the policies underneath them, from an American point of view, lots of them are sound. What he did to get NATO countries actually climbing up and funding what they said they would, what he did in terms of the American economy, there's lots of things he's doing, not what he's saying, but what he's actually doing, that actually makes sense from an American perspective. They hurt Canada, and we should have been smart enough to figure that out. We didn't do it with China. We didn't do it with the U.S. Mr. Carney has not had one success.
It's not one.
And I can tell you this, that elbows up thing, it turned out to only be the first move in Mr. Carney's chicken dance, because that's all it was. And it's been a complete disaster.
Now I have that song going on in my head. Thanks for that, Lawrence. It's going there, and I think Jeff said this when we had talked before about tariffs. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. You said you didn't think that we would see a time where we don't have tariffs with the United States. You think they're here to stay. And the Prime Minister agreed today, saying that he's just seeking lower tariffs on a range of Canadian goods. He acknowledged that Canada probably will not convince Mr. Trump or the United States to drop all tariffs.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, and bearing in mind that that once Donald Trump is gone from his presidency, assuming that he does leave quietly, he didn't last time, but assuming at the end of this term, suppose the American people decide to elect a Democratic president, a Democrat. Well, the Democrats have traditionally been far more protectionist than Republicans, so I think there's every reason to think that at least for the foreseeable future, that we're going to continue to see tariffs. We're going to have to work around them. And I agree with all you guys that Mr. Carney has not produced a win on this front, or particularly on many others as well. There just haven't been very many wins. And in fact, we've talked in the past about in Wab Kinu's case, for example, that he hasn't put the puck in his own net yet. Mark Carney really did it, and I know that Royce has written about this with the Air Canada situation. I don't know if you want to pivot to that one right now, guys, but
yeah, I think we should.
This was a really significant blunder on the Prime Minister's part.
Yeah, this is a topic that is near and dear to Royce's heart. This, I think, was a huge blunder. I don't know how he got out of this one. I mean, I can't believe the media aren't all over this. Well, I can, because they all want to do what the government tells them to do, except the Winnipeg Sun. But Royce, yeah, this is a terrible mistake made by our Prime Minister.
Yeah, the mistake, I think, was the government not allowing kind of collective bargaining to happen, intervening when they really didn't have to. The federal government can use I can't remember the name, the labor code to order people back to work, to basically end strikes and to send people into arbitration. Lawrence would know all about this. Federal government hasn't actually used that power very often until the last year. The Liberal government used it several times to force people to work on a pretty flimsy pretense. And so Air Canada and its flight attendants have been negotiating for some time. Flight attendants went on strike. They were only on strike for one day. And the federal government used this power to legislate them back to work on what I think was a pretty flimsy pretense. There's really no need for it. And we do have the right to bargain. Like it's enshrined in the charter. We have the right to engage in collective bargaining. So the federal government did this. The union, CUPE in this case, had enough of this behavior, and they refused to send the flight attendants back to work. They could potentially be fined $100,000 a day for doing so, but they stuck with this, and then right away they got a deal. They came to an agreement. Federal government, and then after this, Carney and his minister kind of pretending that they'd always been on the flight attendant side in any way. Well, no, you tried to end the strike. You interfered, like 2 days ago. So please don't spin this and making it seem like you were on the flight attendant side. If the union hadn't stuck this out, the flight attendants would have ended up with a worse deal than what they got. So it's just I think Jeff said scoring on your own net. Carney has had so many of these self-owns. He's stepped on so many rakes. This is just the most recent one, and he's alienated labor in Canada. The Liberal government is the most anti-labor government we've seen at the federal level in decades in this country, and he's poisoned that relationship very early on in his mandate.
It's certainly an opportunity for conservatives to start standing up for labor a little bit more and fill that gap, right? And hopefully we'll see that. But I think, Jeff, you had a different perspective on the strike.
Well, I think the idea is, I mean, regardless of whether or not you think, and I agree with Royce that it's enshrined that the CUPE members have a collective right. They have a right to collective bargaining. They have a right to go on strike. But once the law has, and rightly or wrongly, and I think that the federal government was incorrect in ordering them back to work so soon. But once that's done, once you're in defiance of the law of the land, then the federal government's in a position to fire those people. And my view is always, if your workplace is that miserable, if you're so unhappy with your working conditions, with your salary, with your life, where you are working, that you have to walk off the job, go work someplace else.
Jeff, I don't know when
why are you working at some place where you are so miserable?
don't know when the last time you were on an Air Canada flight was, but it sounds like it's been a while. I want to see people who are upset with how the job goes. But I, from my perspective, it's slightly different than all of this. And it's really curious to me. Historically, we complain that the Trudeau Liberals used to wait too long before they'd order people back to work. And now this happened this way. But I think, and it's plain that Mr. Carney gets another goal, another own goal on this one for sure. He does have a great line of defense, which is the bought and paid for mainstream media that hasn't picked up any of this, it seems, or at least not in a clear way. But what I don't understand is air travel is so regulated. How is it that the government didn't send in a mediator, and maybe they did, to say, gentle people, if you want easy, open skies, you better reach a deal. They're not going to work for free. When they're on the ground, flight attendants will not work for free. Figure it out. You have 2 days. You don't have to legislate that. You just have to get people around the table. And I agree, they should have had more of a chance to actually voice their concern and be on strike. But ultimately, that's another failure, in my view. It's getting people around the table and getting them to yes. It shouldn't have been that hard.
And isn't that why we got Carney? Because he's the adult in the room. He's the great negotiator. He's the great manager. He's managed crises. Well, every single crisis, every single situation that I can remember over the last 5 months, he's just completely stepped on a rake. And when are we going to start to see this Carney that we were promised in the election campaign?
Kevin, you're muted.
I haven't done that for a long time. I'm just saying, like, if you look at the CBC report, like they've made Carney out to be a hero for. He's the one who called Donald Trump. He's fixing this trade issue. He started that part of the trade war. Now Trump started the tariff war, but he was the one who put it on, the free trade agreement items that we had. He's the one who's made life more expensive for Canadians. They don't talk about that. They just talk about how he reached out and called Donald Trump, and Donald Trump took his call. However, Donald Trump didn't invite him when he brought in the Europeans to talk about the deal with Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah,
He
who
wasn't at
cares?
the table.
Who cares? I'm starting to sound like I'm a candidate for the Conservative Party, but not that there's anything wrong with that. But the headline in the news was Carney has lengthy substantive discussion, lengthy substantive phone call with Donald Trump. Wow, that's the achievement. Give me a break. At a certain point, it just seems it's spinning.
Well, it was probably lengthy because Trump talked about his golf game for 2.5 hours.
Well, we're 100 days in, and 100 days is usually one of the early benchmarks in any administration. And so, what are the accomplishments of this government in its first 100 days? And it's a short list.
I actually can't think of a thing that I would call a win from the Carney government, not one. And I should tell you, I want it to win. I want Canada to better. I actually, like Royce, I'm very scared for the future of Canada. We, in fact, are living in a situation where Quebec, they're going to go to an election within about a year, and the PQ, who are separatists, are way ahead in the polls. In Alberta, there's a separatist movement, I don't have to tell you, gentlemen, that is very strong and growing, and with good cause. Not that I support it, but I understand the motivation. And Mr. Carney I'm so worried that this is going to be the worst own goal that we could imagine. It's actually, I think there's an existential crisis happening in Canada. We see it growing, we see it building, and I'm very, very, very concerned about it across the board. And I'm a former human rights adjudicator. I'm a free expression guy. And it's appalling what's going on, absolutely appalling. All Canadians should be standing up, not only because it's happening to the Jewish community at one level about them, everyone should be standing up on the economy, on immigration, on every one of these files that has been a disaster. And I wish it wasn't us, but it is.
That is Carney's Canada. A very good discussion today, gentlemen. Thank you very much. We'll have, I'm sure, much more to talk about next week. You can always read Lawrence's column, Royce and Jeff's column in the Winnipeg Sun. Visit winnipegsun.com. Please like this video, share it, and make sure you follow us. Gentlemen, have a great weekend. We'll talk next week.
Well, if you don't want to get shot or are beaten up, don't break into people's houses. Pretty straightforward.
Thanks for watching Inside Politics with Kevin Klein. Please like and subscribe to this channel and visit thewinnipegssun.com for more.